Welcome to Growing Startups, where we talk to growth leaders and marketing professionals about how to drive sustainable growth from the ground up. I'm your host, Evelyn Cools, and I lead marketing for tech startups. I'm excited to share these candid conversations about marketing, culture, collaboration, and everything else that makes startups grow. I have been waiting for this conversation for so long. It is with Dom Belmonte, who leads growth marketing at Sidecar Health. And we also used to work together. So I just love talking to you and can't wait for this conversation. But before we get into it, Dom, could you give us a little bit of a background of, what you've done so far and what you're working on right now?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me. I also have been waiting with bated breath to have this conversation. So yeah, like Evelyn said, I'm Don Belmonte. I've spent the last decade of my career, which is I guess the entirety of it right now, kind of working on how to message tough things to people. So I started in politics. That was super fun and engaging. And then I moved over to the benefits ecosystem where we try to communicate really complex healthcare topics with employers and ultimately their people as well. So I've worked at a variety of different players in the market. I've worked at really big PE backed firms. I've worked at smaller VC firms. I've worked at bootstrapped companies that are, 10-ish people, I should say. And I think sort of the thread that I've needled through, maybe that's the right way to say it, is really just you're taking something super complex and you're trying to present it to an audience in a way that they're going to resonate with it. And then the hardest part has always been, figuring out how does this grow? How do we take this company from its new idea or in politics, this new topic or conversation, and how do we get people to actually glom onto it and resonate with it?
This podcast is brought to you by Evelyn Cools Marketing. If you're an early stage B2B tech founder who wants marketing to actually work, you're in the right place. As a fractional head of marketing and growth advisor, I help early stage B2B startups take marketing from 0 to 1 by building the foundations, testing different channels, and scaling what works. I'm currently offering a free strategy call where I do an audit of what you've tried with marketing so far and share practical advice that I believe will make the biggest impact on your growth engine. Visit evelyncools.com to book your free strategy call today. Now back to the episode.
I don't have a traditional marketing background. I actually have a journalism degree. So I think that's always also been my superpower is I tell people I approach things from a headline, what's newsworthy, what's earned, which is why I've always found marketing to be fascinating because you've got folks that come in with traditional marketing backgrounds who've worked in large companies, large budgets, and large teams. But I started my workout writing press releases and calling people to beg them to post about me. So, having that little unique background, I think has been the catalyst in helping me try to be a better growth marketer.
I couldn't agree more. And I actually didn't realize, well, two things. I didn't realize you had a journalism background. So that's really interesting. And I also am not a traditional marketer. So I feel like we always think a little bit outside of the box, which is awesome. And then the second piece, I totally mispronounced your last name, because I don't think I've ever had to say it. I just call you Dom. You are Dom. So Belmonte, not Belmonte.
I actually don't correct people because my family would say Belmonte. They'd
But
be
that's
very
how
Italian
I
with
was
the hands
thinking
and
about that.
so I almost never correct people on my name, but yeah, Belmonte. But yeah, it's kind of weird when you work at a small company. I actually don't think I ever refer to people by their last names.
Yeah. No, I really was because I know you have an Italian background. And so I was trying to think, okay, how do you pronounce this in Italian? And maybe that's what it was
You just got
more
to add the
like.
hands into it.
Just add the hands. Amazing. Well, I think you have such an interesting background. And then also you're talking about, making really complex ideas, topics easy to understand, which is such a tough thing to do. And I think you're really great at. So I just always loved working with you for that reason. And also that the just growth mindset you have is so unique. So yeah, just such a fan.
The feeling is very mutual.
Thanks, Tom. All right. I know we have a lot to talk about when it comes to marketing, but something I do like to ask people at the very beginning of our episodes is, Do you have a favorite wellness practice or ritual that keeps you grounded in the crazy startup slash scale up world?
Yes, I actually do. And I learned it from my crazy not work life. I had an amazing therapist that used to help me with my anxiety and was really big on journaling what your biggest wins of the day were. So I'm a big journaler and I was struggling with a lot of big life changes. And, she would say, look, I know you maybe didn't move the needle on this big thing, but like, what was your win today? Like, was, maybe getting up and getting out of bed and changing a win for you? And so I started doing this. This would have been like, gosh, in 2020. I mean, middle of the pandemic, mental health really struggling. And I would write down, between 1 and 3 wins for the day. And now, as I work at startups and scale ups, I do the same thing because you'll have weeks where you have like 2 things on your to do list and you haven't crossed either of them out yet. And it's really easy to just think that you're not good at it or you haven't achieved what you needed. But you lose sight of the fact that you're stacking wins in order to knock those things off your to do list. So I do it every single day. I do it in my personal life. I do it in my work life. I journal. How did I win today? 1 to 3 bullets. If you've got more than 3 bullets, God bless you.
You're
I
flying.
don't yeah, I don't have enough time in the day. I'd love to have you on the podcast so that I can learn more about how you do it. But that's my wellness ritual. It works personal and work. And I feel like for a lot of you guys listening right now, work and personal become completely intertwined. So I definitely recommend doing that.
What a great tip. I don't think I've ever heard someone say that. And I do something similar, but also very different. So I think I need to start integrating this at the end of my days because at the beginning, I try to write 3 things I'm grateful for, and that really like sets the tone for also not getting too caught up in like the stress and the whirlwind of where the day takes me, always like grounding me back to what matters. But I do like the idea of having some kind of a recap at the end of the day too and feeling like what you did was successful. So gotta
Yeah.
do this.
Yeah, I think what's hard too is like the reason a lot of us are good marketers is because we're aspirational people. We see visions for things that I think maybe non-creatives don't. I am almost like to a fault. Like I need to like be smacked across the face with what I actually did in order to believe it. So that's always why I have to like bookend the day with it.
Yeah, I love it. Well, let's get into it. So, something that I know we talked about a lot is how the B2B market is changing, how customers are changing. I think a lot of people are thinking about this right now. Things that used to work just aren't working the same way anymore. Like, I'm not really seeing a lot of success with things like gated playbooks or all these things that used to be like, oh, if you want to be a growth marketer, this is the type of content you create. You run these kinds of paid ads, you do automated outbound, like all these motions that used to be like core to marketing, I feel like are changing. And I'd love to get your take on that and what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really tricky in like I'll look at this through the lens of like the beginning of 2020 to now because I think that's sort of when I noticed a lot of shifts in how we market. Obviously with the pandemic and moving virtual, we started seeing things like webinars and virtual events pop up. And so you all of a sudden now started seeing people really comfortable with consuming media in a different way. So that was the first initial change. You saw people who used to traditionally focus on going in person, hitting the event roadshow, now going online. But then you also started seeing companies spend money in large amounts on paid media, whether it was in our industry, you have a lot of trade publications where you could do paid ads, dedicated email sends, but then there's also just the paid quote unquote media of like LinkedIn lead gen or even Facebook and meta ads, like to an extent. I mean, I think I'll touch on that in a little bit, but I think as you started seeing in the like first sort of half of when the pandemic was like 2020 to 2022 was like the pre AI, I would say like content push where I felt like content was king. As a journalist and someone who's got that background, that is how I grew my career. I was formerly at a company called Vita Health. We blew up in the pandemic. We were doing virtual healthcare and we rode the wave of virtual events and virtual media. We were churning out content, again, pre AI building playbooks, building ebooks, building case studies, webinars. I mean, I think I was doing 2 webinars a month. I was doing probably one, what I called actionable guide a month. And we were truly treating our marketing team like a editorial newsroom. It was amazing. It's how that company was able to grow. But then as you started getting past 2022 and you start seeing AI come out, content was no longer king. It was no longer a differentiator to have smart, good writers on your team because everyone is smart and everyone now can write. And then you also don't have to be super creative on your own. You can actually use AI to help you build your editorial room out. So as the pandemic started exiting and people started doing in-person activations more, content is now no longer a commodity, it's a table stakes standard. And so the thing I started noticing was the paid advertising, paid media landscape became incredibly saturated. I would say in the last 2-ish, 3 years, LinkedIn has become almost impossible to market on. And if anyone from LinkedIn is listening, like I would love to get some insight from them too. But the problem is that you are just saturated. Every single company is making guides, they're making ebooks, they're even doing podcasts and webinars again. And it's like, a barrage of content on one single stream. And it almost feels like the Redditification, if you will, of LinkedIn, because you also now see people using LinkedIn to share personal updates about their lives. Obviously, it's very much still a professional platform, but it is very different than the LinkedIn of 2018, 2019. And so I think immediately looking at that from my perspective as a growth marketer, it's just there's no ROI on advertising on a channel like LinkedIn, which used to be the cash cow of marketing tactics because you have great audience filters on it. It's incredibly targeted. You were able to do gated content in a really efficient way. And so it was 2 thumbs up, but no one's filling out forms anymore. With content no longer being a commodity, you're asking someone to give you their personal identifying information in exchange for what? Something that they can go on to ChatGPT and find. And so I think that that was the biggest sort of shift that I had noticed. And then I think the other hard thing too is like now as you start to think about, well, where is your audience? Things like meta ads, I used to always say, don't waste your time on it because if you're in a B2B business like I've been, your buyers are on LinkedIn. But now, as we know, LinkedIn is saturated. If paid media is saturated, I am actually noticing that in the B2B space, we're leveraging a lot of what I would call traditional direct to consumer marketing tactics as a way to break through the noise. And so, what I'm kind of noticing as a B2B marketer is that we've basically, soured our own well a little bit here. And so we're now all going to different areas, typically the areas that we were, not going to a few years ago as green space to start to get in front of buyers.
I have never heard anyone lay it out like this. I think you're spot on. That's crazy to think about it. And it's such a short amount of time, like 5 years. That's it. And it has just changed so much. And I think that's why a lot of marketers are feeling very lost with like what they're supposed to be doing. And why I also think that maybe marketing degrees are a little bit futile because like none of this we would have learned in school, even if we did go to college for that. So I think it's a very exciting time and also a little bit of a chaotic time, like trying to figure out what works. But you're so right with the like using direct to consumer tactics as a B2B company. That's so interesting. I had never really framed it that way, but I've been getting ads for like HubSpot, for example, on YouTube, on Facebook, like all these places where I spend my personal time more so than LinkedIn, even though that is also becoming like a personal space, like you said. But I have to say, my attention is a lot more open in those other channels because I'm not already being inundated. I mean, my email inbox is like, I don't even want to look at it because every time I sign up for anything, I get like an email a day from these B2B brands. And I'm like, you guys got to chill.
Well, and that's, I think a few minutes ago, you said something like automated outbound. That's the problem, though, is that now because you can sign up for, what feels like an infinite amount of things, and you don't need a human to be doing this type of follow up, you're getting bombarded with emails. And like, it's so funny. So I'm in the role that I had at Airbo with you. I've never in my life had so many automated growth marketing vendors reach out to me, almost to a point where I like wanted to read these emails because it was like great market research on what not to do.
Yeah.
But, it's like in this day and age where people are questioning whether the content they look at online is real or not, the same thing goes for the like type of relationship that you're trying to create with your buyer. Like, do you want your buyer to think that everything that they do is automated or that they're talking to a chatbot? The reality is like that might have felt really sexy a couple years ago. That's kind of like giving customer support now more than it's giving like buying. And so I think also like for marketers, what's really hard is it's like you're trying to create this super authentic view of your brand in the market and you're trying for it to feel really personal. But how do you become authentic and personal in an age where everything is becoming automated? And I think that's why a lot of marketers are feeling nostalgic about the days where we were making infographics or the days that we were making guides and we were working with designers to make them look really pretty and PDF them and slap them behind gates because that level of nostalgia still reminds you of how to build the ethos of a brand.
So how do we do that now? Like, what are your go-tos, or where do you think you're going to be investing in the next year, for example?
Yeah. So there's a few things that I think are still really important. I will die on the hill that you have to have a virtual presence with your company. I think that the most successful companies are the companies that are doing exactly what we're doing right here. You take interesting people, you put them online, and you just get them talking about the things that excite them. There is this belief, and I have worked at companies that have had all different ways of approaching it, where you can take a light touch with sales, you can take a hard touch with sales. I have always felt like marketing, and this is my PR background, but marketing to me is an extension of thought leadership. I have never looked at marketing as an extension of sales enablement. I think you've got this sort of continuum that you can look at. And by the way, I love both sides of it, but to me, they are two completely different things. A sales driven marketing function is not going to win in this current mediascape, marketing landscape, et cetera, because you're coming across too cheeky. You're coming across too salesy. And people are saying, I don't need to waste my time with that because I read right through it. So I do think that thought leadership is incredibly important. Doing webinars, doing podcasts, whether they're earned or whether they're hosted in house, is essential because people trust people. And I think that's also sort of my other avenue that I want to focus on in our conversation today is sort of like moving back to a lot of pre-COVID tactics because the reality is everything online is saturated. So we're kind of moving back to the pre-COVID world of needing to do in-person activations, calling people, having conversations with them, getting them on webinars, getting them on podcasts, and doing things like in person events again. And it's flexing a new muscle because I think what breaks through the noise is authenticity. What breaks through the noise is actually building networks of people who believe in what you're doing. And that sounds really crazy, but the reality is you're not going to build that community through paid ads on LinkedIn. You're not going to build that community by doing sponsored webinars, even things like trade publications do $20,000 to $30,000 webinars, and act like it's a drop in the bucket when that could be your entire marketing budget for the year if you're that lucky. And so I think, again, it is trying to just put your authentic selves out there, whether you're a founder, whether you're a founding commercial leader, or whether it is actually just someone in your network. That is also how I am starting to build things out. I, at my new job, have a budget. We don't need to delve into numbers, but that doesn't change the fact that I am trying to actively build out a speaker bureau. Who are people in the market that care about what you're talking about right now? That is a better endorsement than your automated SDR who's sending, 4 to 5 emails a week.
I mean, you say that maybe that sounds crazy, building an online community and really focusing on authenticity and connection. But to me, that sounds like the most no-brainer thing I've heard all week. So you're speaking my language.
Well, and I think that's also why like you get a lot of people like me on your podcast, and I think that's why a lot of us like meeting each other and why we all add each other on LinkedIn because we have validated each other's approach. And in the same way, like, think if you're a founder or a CEO and you find another founder CEO who validates your thought process, validates your product. It's almost funny. It's like I'm thinking about, if you purchase something on Amazon, like 5 years ago, I never looked at the reviews. I was kind of like, oh, whatever. Like, it's not a big deal. Like, I know this is going to be fine. I almost always have to read the review now. And it's like a random person that I have no clue who they are, but they write the most glowing review about this eye mask. And you're like, oh my God, I need to spend the $10 on this item. This was the most glowing recommendation I could have gotten. That's a consumer concept of leveraging reviews, crowdsourcing for feedback, but bring that into the B2B space because buyers are receptive to what other buyers are thinking. And I think that that is the most important. It's very undertapped, but it's also very affordable because you're basically getting the people who are using the product right now. And it's kind of like, dog fooding a little bit.
Yep. Something you said, which I think really connects with this topic, is using, direct to consumer tactics in the B2B space, which to me also includes the idea of influencers. And I've been seeing that a lot of marketers want to invest in influencers in 2026, but I don't know if we've like cracked the code on the B2B side or at least like know the best way to do it. And maybe that's actually great because you can take this so many different directions, whether it's like really small influencers who have like a super niche audience that's actually very valuable to you, or bigger names on LinkedIn or other places. How do you look at the idea of like B2B influencers? Is this something you want to use? Like, I'd love to hear how you feel about that.
Yeah, this is actually probably the topic I'm most passionate slash excited about because, I'm a millennial. I love influencer culture. I live in Los Angeles. I'm kind of smacked across the face with it all the time. So I find satire a lot in the like direct to consumer influencer world. But it's funny because that exact same trend is happening in our B2B space right now. And it's been happening very quietly for the last few years. And it's going to become, in my opinion, the best way for companies to scale up in the next few years. And so I'm seeing it kind of happen a couple of ways, kind of going back to that speaker bureau concept that I had in a former role. I was working at a clinical product. And so influencers were a couple areas. For one, I wanted to make sure that in the market, we were clinically validated by an influencer. So we looked at doctors that were, and at the time I was doing a virtual diabetes and weight loss management. So we were looking what doctors are going on NBC, are going on CBS, going on CNN and talking about obesity, who's talking about GLP-1s, who's on LinkedIn talking about them, who's sitting on boards. And we started working with our executive leadership team to figure out we need to probably bring on a clinical board of, 2 to 3 different people who have names out there in the market. And you know what? Let's offer them a rev share, or we offer them sort of a, stipend based on pipeline growth as a result of their actions. So rolling into that, we're talking zero sum unless it's successful. But what you get is in that space, it was clinical validation. That was essential in getting regular everyday buyers to listen to us. But then there's also this sort of second kind of influencer. And I've actually seen that firsthand through my father, actually, where you're seeing incredibly well connected industry veterans, people who are approaching retirement, people who are maybe just later stage in their careers who are quite literally just connecting you to people. My father does this for a handful of other startups in my space. He's a former 45-year veteran in the consulting practice based in Chicago and knew a large network of people. And they are creating arrangements at different startups that work for him, introducing buyers, other resellers, even other clinicians in the area to their sales team, to their buyers. And so what you're seeing now is kind of this same exact way that direct to consumer brands are picking influencers. You're picking influencers for two reasons. One is because they're a subject matter expert. So you believe in what they are doing. The other area is that person's famous. And in B2B world, being famous isn't, oh, you're in movies and you're going to all these fancy parties. Being famous might look like that person has 5,000 plus followers on LinkedIn. Famous could be that person is an EVP at a Fortune 500 company. Being famous can also just mean that that person really cares about putting this company's name in headlights and is really out there being their genuine selves. And they know some people in the industry. You need to start thinking from a B2B perspective, how can I leverage that network? And so my advice and how I kind of start building them is I treat it like I'm hosting a webinar. So I literally call it my speaker bureau. It's something I used to do in politics when I would schedule press conferences and I would schedule events in district. You'd start to think of who can, in politics, I was like, who could talk about healthcare? Who could talk about gun safety? Who could talk about tax policy? And you'd start to pick people who had these areas of influence and you literally put it on a spreadsheet. And for B2B businesses, how I've always done that is, okay, so which clients do I have that love us the most? Okay, great. Start to write them down. Which clients do I know that maybe want to be putting themselves out more for professional development? Because you'll be surprised. I think people are sometimes afraid to ask clients to do things because you're just so thankful for the business. But you forget that your buyer is also trying to do things. It's like a parent. You forget that they're a human and they're an adult sometimes. You forget your clients also have aspirations beyond just signing contracts for you. So you realize that these people also want professional development opportunities. And so you slot those people out. Then you start to add the quote unquote influencers. If you have a clinical product, or maybe you have a really technical product that requires some sort of domain expertise, start thinking of who those people are. Go and just Google search. Look for, who is speaking on these topics in the news, who is speaking on these topics at conferences. That will help you figure out who your influencer network is. And then the last sort of business here is like, look, what's your goal here? Is your goal brand awareness and eyeballs? Stick. If it's that, then you start to think of placements like webinars, events, etc. But if your goal is like, look, I'm a founder-led sales team right now, and we need to close, let's just say, 3 enterprise logos in the next year. Enterprise to me is usually like 10,000 people and above. Maybe for you, getting on a webinar is not that important, but maybe doing a influencer dinner is. So maybe you're having a couple of those really well-connected consultants that you know, and maybe it's a client of yours, and you pick a city in the US, and yeah, you're going to spend some money, but you're going to do a very intimate dinner where they're inviting their friends. You give that person a rev share or a commission, quote unquote, if they close any deals as a result of that. That way, your investment into that dinner is food and drinks. But what you get out of that dinner could be that person who knows the people there closing 1 to 2 deals for you, while you, CEO, are out there fundraising or focused on product roadmap or other areas. And so I start looking at, in the same way that that's how, you see these direct to consumer brands, they're doing intimate dinners, they're sponsoring them. And then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, how did they get this gigantic ad campaign paid for? And it's like, well, because, the magic happens in that room. And so I think, like I said, the 3 things I would focus on are, first of all, like build out, like, what's your network? Think of what your goals are, and then you can start to creatively think about how you want to fund it. Because the reality is there's going to be people listening to this with all different funding models. I've supported all different funding models, and it works in all of them. You just have to approach it in those 3 different ways, and it'll work for you when you build the right strategy.
what I love about this is that it is not that overt influencer marketing that we think of when we think of influencers. So you're not saying anything of, have people write LinkedIn posts that are clearly an ad for your product. You don't have to think about it in a way where they're like overtly selling your product for you. It's more like a partnership, which love. Like this does not feel like blatantly communicating about like the things that you do, but it's more relationship building, making sure you're connected to that network that they have. And I think that's so powerful. Something that I think a lot of marketers or founders are always looking for is repeatable processes and things that look like they scale. And what we're saying here is, these are not necessarily things that scale in the traditional sense, but are very targeted, like super account based marketing vibes. Like what you said, dinners, for example, that's, only a handful of people if you want to have a very successful conversation during that dinner. I know that that's something that you really focus on, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on those super intimate events versus really big conferences, for example.
Absolutely. No, I think the one thing you said that I think is so essential is this should not be hashtag ad. Like the reason this works is because it's authentic. And so that's to why I think I'll trip over my words a little bit because I love in person events and I think they are incredibly exciting. They are just incredibly expensive and they have priced out a lot of people. And so, in the same vein, as I said, think about your goal. Is your goal brand awareness or is your goal pipeline generation? If your goal is brand awareness and you just have buco bucks in your pocket, in-person activations are amazing. But it almost feels like every single national conference has become like the Sundance Film Festival or Cannes. And it's like, oh my gosh, name the top 50 logos that have ever existed in the world. And they all have these crazy brand activations. And the price to enter is, at a minimum, 25 to 50K. I know companies that are spending seven figures at these things. And so that's like just not approachable. So, why I like in person dinners and why I think, and I say in person dinners, it could be in person anything, like whatever works for your industry. Like my space, the benefits in HR space, HR people, surprisingly, when they're not on the clock, love to go out and be entertained. So that's just how my industry tends to do things. But I know industries where people are, if you work in like an outdoor industry, I know people that are doing really cool outdoorsy things, like that just wouldn't resonate with me. So again, like back to authenticity, like think about what works for your brand and how you want to make things happen. It's not a one size fits all. But why I like those is because your front end investment is you get what you pay for. So if you do a 10-person event, you can control pricing on basically all aspects of it because you're not doing a booth, you're not, paying for your logo to be slapped on a program. And again, this isn't meant to be a, smack you across the face with an ad event. If you're doing a dinner, I'm not like holding up a press conference in here with, logos of my company all over the wall. And I'm not, giving you swag bags with my logo on a thing of mints and a stress ball and this and that. Like I'm just taking you out to a nice meal and we're going to, chit chat about things. I'll probably give a toast about the product and we'll probably talk a little bit about it. But the whole goal is actually to just get to know people on a personal level. It's not meant to be this slap in the face lead generation activity. And so I say that because I am currently on a team with a budget, and my company's goals are twofold. There is a level of brand awareness, and we're breaking into a new market where we have to spend money on large activations. I'm going to a few large conferences where I am not proud of what the invoice says. That said, the goal for my company and the goal that our investors have is to get eyeballs on our product. And so I am doing my due diligence by checking that box and showing up to these places. But I'm wrapping around those places with intimate events. And that's how I'm able to stretch my dollars further in my bigger budget. So we're showing up to these conferences. You're doing the sexy booth. And I think we're paying for like our logo on hotel keys. And it's like, okay, not my favorite investment, but we're also doing dinners the night before and the night after, where we're having our clinical board take people out to a meal where we are literally just talking to them about what's going on at their company. And we're talking about healthcare and the rising cost of it. And we're also just networking and trying to build relationships because don't get me wrong, we're getting what we pay for by putting a booth out there. But I guarantee you that all net new business that comes from this event will be generated at those two ancillary events because in the same way that LinkedIn is crowded, so is a trade show floor. People are going booth to booth looking for swag. And I could talk for hours about swag. It seems like it's such a small thing, but for some odd reason, it seems to be like one of the hottest things for like B2B marketers. And like that's just not the case. Like people are going to your booth, they're going to get their badge scanned, and then you're going to have either an automated SDR or a real SDR follow up, and you're probably going to go nowhere. You're going to probably spend about like 3 weeks sending one email a week to them, and that person's just going to go right back into a marketing nurture. If that's what your company needs to generate brand awareness, that's what you need to generate brand awareness. But if you're trying to actually move the needle on real deals closing, what's happening is these dinners, you're putting one salesperson there. So I have always operated under the guise that sales needs to sit in the passenger seat. It's probably why I almost always beef with the salesperson at my company. And it's kind of why I like my best friend at my last job was the sales guy, which was kind of weird because usually I've always beefed with sales. But I think when you find a salesperson who gets it, and it is the I can close by just being myself and I don't need to be, just shaking hands and kissing babies on the floor of a trade show. I can really make something happen. So to me, that's why that's so important. And then kind of hearkening in on that conversation about why having a partner or why having this influencer network matters is that person can be accountable to inviting people. So if you're talking workload, like you're a founder led sales team, maybe you've got one marketer and your marketer is not traveling for events or is not able to go on the road, you have this person who you have is inviting people to the event in the same way that they're hosting a dinner party and they have skin in the game. So they have an incentive to want to bring people in, but they're not getting paid out unless they're closing deals. And so again, I think what's happening here is the conference floor became so saturated in the same way that LinkedIn did. And so what you're seeing is now we're growth hacking and creating ways to have a third space without it feeling like it's the, 8x8 space on the showroom floor. I think what's also kind of tricky about conferences, and if any conference people are listening, whatever, but they're pay to play. Like, let's just be honest here. Like, anyone who says they're not pay to play is lying or they're a really good salesperson. But, like, 5, 6 years ago, you used to be able to apply to speak at conferences, and now speaking is $25,000. And you're like, well, what the heck has happened in the last 5 years? And what's happened to event companies is what's happened to every single company. They're losing money. And so they're also trying to cover, their expenses. And so I think what has happened again, like before, it used to be the person who was the smartest, the person who was the most creative and really built out thought leadership got chosen. And so you had interesting topics, you had real thought leaders. Now that is translating into which company has the biggest budget. So it's kind of like politics in America. Whoever has the most amount of money is the loudest shouter in the room. And I think that that is what has made those events so tricky. There are a few, and I will say, I don't need to name them by names, but there are a handful of large national coalitions that have really protected the speaking circuit. And I applaud them for doing that. Not everyone has done that. And so the reality is, like, outside of those handful of events, pretty much anyone who's a thought leader is boxed out of speaking unless you happen to have a very large budget. And again, that's also why I think another fun tactic for wrapping around conferences is doing a little video recap after. So what I've done oftentimes is I've had events where we haven't sponsored them and you spend $1,000 for a badge and then we have our CEO or we'll have someone record record a video from the floor, or they'll record a video sitting, in the bar in the hotel lobby or the coffee shop in the hotel lobby. And they'll do a quick, like, here's my three recaps from this week. Hey, anyone here and like want to catch up and grab a coffee? And now all of a sudden you have started hooking into the content and you're becoming almost a commentator for the event. And that's completely cost effective because you've only purchased a pass, you have access to the floor, you have access to people there, and you're relying on someone who just is able to leverage their network. And so, again, it's finding those people and leveraging them and incentivizing them.
Wow, I feel like you just gave like a million ideas and so much actual like practical advice. I think it's easy to stay super high level with this kind of stuff, but these are all things people can actually try right now. So I think that's awesome. And you really made me think as well about I'm very much in the same mindset of you have to show up at events in a very intentional way. You can't just be there with a booth and that's it. Like if you just have a booth, don't even like maybe just attend, instead of getting a booth because of what you said too with, there's just so much noise. Like people are not even really going to booths that much to actually connect and follow through on these like demos that they requested. But I definitely had the experience of going and like writing a recap, for example, from the event and finding very specific people to send it to when it was me and the founders at that conference as attendees, but you are still there. You can still have the content. You can still, take a little video and have your logo somewhere on it. Like it almost feels like free promotion. So that is a great, I think, super low cost way to do it. I also really like what you said about partners and, using their network to set up these team dinners and really think about the workload. And something that I've seen go not well at all is, for example, a company at a conference that I was at like 2 years ago. They did a happy hour, like all expenses paid drinks after the second to the last night, but they were only promoting it from the booth. And I ended up like going with one of the co-founders of the company. And I think there were 5 people there in a space that was maybe for 100. And they had all these drinks, they had spent all this money, but they weren't really intentional about who they're inviting, how they're going to make sure that they show up, and actually thinking like, what do people really want? Maybe they don't want like another happy hour. Maybe they want like a really nice dinner where they can decompress after a really busy conference day and talk to peers that they actually care about, like people that are on their level. So just being very intentional about how you show up, I think is the key.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think the reason why I feel this way is because I have been in positions where you think things are for certain, but they're not always true. And so, a good scenario, maybe a handful of folks on this call will resonate with is when you get budget, just because you get it 1 year does not mean it's secured forever. I was at a previous company. We had secured a relatively healthy Series D fund, and I had about $1.5 million budget for events, which to me felt like I was like, my company must be IPOing tomorrow if we're spending 1.5 million on conferences. And then you see how much events run, and then you really are like, whoa, $1 million does not stretch you as far as you think it would. That was not for certain. Every single year after that, my budget got cut 50%. So I went from managing about $1 million to right before I left that company, just over $300,000. And this is all included. So event people who know, I mean, nothing is just the printed price on the event. You're shipping things, you're paying for travel, you're paying for salespeople to get a coffee in the morning, all these things. I've had to learn how to be incredibly intentional about which levers you pull. I've also hosted happy hours where 5 people have showed up, and then I've had to go and have the conversation with the CFO about why that didn't work. And so I have unfortunately been burned by that before. And so I think that's my other sort of piece of advice here is like, if you start intentional, no matter how big or how little your budget is, you're going to be a more cost effective marketer as a result of it. When a lot of companies get fundraising, and you'll get, especially on the VC side, where you're going to get these outrageous lead targets because you just got a bunch of money and they are telling you you've got to show up every single place. But that number is not going to be guaranteed. And in fact, if you don't show ROI on that, let's just call it $100,000, you're going to potentially lose your job and you're going to lose that funding. And so it almost has to be treated like this is your only at bat. And so I think that's also why I think really, really small when it comes to events. Like even small things like having your founders there working the floor without a booth is so much better of an investment than like sending, I don't know, just your marketer or by just sponsoring a booth and just having them sit there. Like that is not how you're going to grow your business. And so I think that's why I feel so passionate about events. I don't know. I also just think it's like, it's what makes marketing fun because you also get to wrap around events. And that's another really important tactic where it's like, look, if you're trying to make your presence look bigger at events, having your founders do outreach. If let's say you're lucky enough to get a registration list, doing founder led outreach is a huge way of getting people to pay attention to you. Bringing a client, offering a client the opportunity to travel with you, huge. And a fun thing too is a lot of clients can't actually get gifts. So they have to pay for their travel. Another fun thing you can think about in order to save money. And all you have to do is just make sure your client is happy and make sure they have things to do and are excited. And so I think the reality is what my biggest sort of takeaway as we've had this conversation is like what works is not going to be one size fits all, but you have to get back in that box of thinking creatively. And I'm not talking creatively like tactics. Like I mean creatively like from an editorial perspective. Like would you click on this link? If you are scrolling through NBC News, is this the headline that you are going to click into? If you are on Twitter and your personal Twitter, is that a thing you're going to actually like? Because if you wouldn't do that in your personal lives, you're sure as heck not going to do it in your professional life. And I think that's the biggest misconception that marketers have is that they treat B2B audiences like they are curmudgeons, and maybe some of them are, but the reality is they're humans. And if you aren't going to click on it in your personal life, you can't expect someone to click on it in their professional life.
I feel like I need this soundbite and to like save this as a quote somewhere.
Well,
That
I
was
mean, look,
great.
we're guilty of it. Like we worked in an HR audience. You think all these HR people are curmudgeons, and I'm like, no, that is because you just come from this position that B2B marketing has to be not sexy. And the reality is, maybe it's not as sexy as like going to the Cannes Film Festival and having these gigantic $1 million in-person marketing activations. But I promise you, it is. Like I promise you, it is that sexy, and it can be that creative. It looks very different. And I think that's why people get super tripped up by it, especially when you're working with founders who maybe aren't as familiar with B2B marketing. Like I think everyone thinks they're a marketer. I feel like being a CMO, you almost need to have to go through training to be a therapist because no matter who it is, whether it's the salesperson, the founder, maybe it's the same person, you tend to therapize them because you are often being their translator, and many times there's a disconnect. And so I think that's also kind of one of the interesting things here is like, look, you can put B2B marketing terms in the lens of direct to consumer for it to resonate with people who maybe aren't fully bought into what you're doing quite yet.
I have for sure been. I feel like I could be a therapist at this point, a founder therapist.
Yeah, whether you wanted to or not.
Yeah. Dom, this has been such a fun conversation, and I feel like we could honestly talk for hours, but we are getting close to the end of the hour here, which is usually when I like to close things down. So let's like take it back to you because we've talked a lot about all the great audiences and all the tactics, but what is something that you're excited about in both your personal and your professional life?
Ooh, that's a great question. In my professional life, so I'm in a new role right now, and honestly, I'm really excited to just like start digging into it. I think my I work at a company that has a really cool product. Definitely, check out my LinkedIn and look at that kind of stuff because as someone who's got a PR background, and that's not a sales plug, as someone who has a PR background, I think it's so cool to work for companies that have things that are headline worthy and a product that's headline worthy. And I don't take that for granted. I believe the stars truly aligned in finding something like that. But I'm really excited, honestly, to roll my sleeves up and build. My company is building out a function for the first time that's doing in person events, and that is really focusing on building out a stronger enterprise employer market. And so, even though it is a scale up in the common terms, I think that we would align on, it is a startup in the sense that I'm going to get to roll my sleeves up and be the first person doing a lot of the things that we're going to work on. And so, it's kind of something I'm really excited about because I was previously at a smaller startup where I was really excited to roll my sleeves up. But as anyone who's on these calls know, it's really hard work to be in that pre seed, pre series A world. And I am just excited to take some of the skills from that, but at a company that's potentially just a little bit larger. That's a really new challenge for me. So I love challenges. I'm excited about that. And honestly, in my personal life, I am really excited this year to pick back up on running. I could talk about like, things in my like relationship and moving in with a partner. And those are things that are exciting. But I think my biggest win from this last year was that I ran a half marathon and I felt like I was stimulating my brain outside of work. I think all of us are really guilty, especially when we work at startups and scale ups, that our work is our life. So you bring it home. It is the thing you're thinking about when you fall asleep. It's the thing you think about when you wake up. And I just kind of felt like I wasn't using my brain or my body. And I'm not an athlete by trade. I've kept teaching myself how to persist and how to train. And so I'm excited. I want to run another half marathon this year, maybe even a marathon. But mostly I just want to do something for myself that's not work related but still requires me to have to think and make a plan and follow through on it.
I love both of those things. And congrats again on the new role. I think it's very exciting. And you have to send me the booths that you end up putting together because I'm always in awe of like some of these companies that have massive budgets and they're the ones in the center of the room and they just have like the craziest things happening. Like they have their own podcast studio or literally just like such cool stuff. So I'm very excited for you as well to be able to like play with that because that's different for sure. And then I have to get back into running. That's a good reminder.
I know. I was going to say that was one of the first things we talked about in your interview was
Yeah.
that you were excited after you had your baby.
Yeah. Which, I have done some jogs, but I have to say a half marathon is like one of the things I really want to do. I've run the distance of a half marathon before, but never like a race, which I think that's
That's the
like the
hardest
next thing
part.
I'd love to do.
the
Yeah.
hardest part is running the 13 miles. The race is pretty easy once you think about it because you got people cheering you on and you get to eat a big breakfast afterwards, but
Love a big breakfast.
uh, totally.
All right, well, Dom, thank you so much for being here. Final question, and I think I know the answer, but wanted to ask anyway. What's the best way for people to find you and connect with you?
Yeah, just add me on LinkedIn. Dominic Belmonte, I think, is my LinkedIn name. I go by Dom, but LinkedIn's, more professional. But add me on there. I'm trying to build my network, just like all of us are. And if you found anything interesting and you are like, oh gosh, I want to learn more, like seriously, just DM me. I check LinkedIn like I check Instagram. It's just like any other form of personal social media. And I am always happy to help and just chat all things growth, marketing, events, and even running if that's interesting to you.
Amazing. Yeah, I think we're all trying to build out our personal brand on there. And you're right, I check it probably even more than Instagram at this point, which is crazy.
And I would imagine too, you now with like, growing your business and growing your family, like you're even noticing that you're pushing a lot more content out there that maybe even a few years ago you wouldn't. And I feel the same way. I'm kind of kicking myself. I was going to post something after I did my last half marathon about kind of what we just talked about. And I hesitated to because I didn't really want to like make the jump from posting about work to personal. But I think actually in doing that, it was pretty inauthentic of me. And so I'm going to push my own self to continue to take my own advice and guidance and leveraging that channel in the exact same way that it was meant to be. And that's just building networks.
I love it. Well, I think that you can still do it. I mean, you could always do a little recap of the year and still talk about it. So I mean, it's a little scary. Like I have to say, showing up there when you talk about more than just like your work highlights is a little bit daunting. So I definitely feel you, but you have so much great stuff to share. So here's your like push to do it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dom, for being here. This was such a great conversation. And to everyone listening, I will see you in the next one. Thanks for listening to Growing Startups. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to give us a rating so more people can find the show. So happy you're here, and see you in the next one.